Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nature Live, the online show where we meet the people from behind the scenes at the Natural History Museum in London, as well as a variety of special guests to talk all things natural history. Can you remember where you were when the country went into lockdown due to COVID-19? Chances are most of us were already at home when we were told we needed to stay there to slow the spread of the virus. Some of us may still have been at work delivering essential goods and services to those that needed them. But most of us were probably not thousands of miles away in one of the most remote regions of the planet, Antarctica. My guest today is a PhD student who found themselves on a remote island off the coast of Antarctica at the time that much of the world began going into an unprecedented lockdown. Far from civilization, and with only limited and sporadic news getting through, it was a nerve-wracking and uncertain time. Let's find out what was going on at that remote island and how they managed to get home in the midst of a global pandemic. Jaz Millar, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you? It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here. I'm fine, thank you.
Well, we already know there's obviously a happy ending to the story because you're here talking to me today. So that's good to hear. And to those of you that are watching at home, if you've got any questions for Jaz about her work and about her adventure during the pandemic, then please pop them in the chat and we'll do our very best to answer as many of them as we can. So, Jaz, to start us off, what exactly were you doing in Antarctica in the first place? Because it's not exactly somewhere that most of us will be passing through.
Yeah, that's true. I am a polar microbiologist. So I was looking to collect samples of microorganisms from a range of habitats on and near glaciers. That's what I do for my field work.
Right. So you're particularly interested in the microscopic life, the stuff that we don't normally see. And in fact, you're going to places where at a glance it looks like there's no life there at all.
Yes, exactly. It's things that you need a microscope to be able to see the individual organisms. Most of them are only one cell or a very small number of cells. So they're things like bacteria, single-celled fungi, and then algae and the distant relatives of animals such as the protists that are, again, microscopic. So I've been looking at, this is a cryoconite hole, which is one of the habitats I study, which is a small meltwater pocket of water and sediment that accumulates on the glacier. They may look white and pristine from a distance, but actually they're full of lots of different habitats, including streams and snow algae patches, ponds, and cryoconite holes like this.
So these are quite small. I guess it's very easy to miss them if you were walking across a snowfield, a bit like we can see here.
Well, this one here, I think we actually found when the field guide put his foot through it. Sometimes then that's the way that you find these habitats. They might be buried under the ice and snow, and it's only when you trip over them, then you notice that they're there. And so then, I collect as much material as I can from the bottom of there. They're hidden in plain sight.
So I guess you like to explore a lot of environments that we typically might not think to go and look for life.
Yes, I said to the field guides that I work with have often seen these habitats before. When I describe what a cryoconite hole is or a meltwater pond, they say, "Oh yeah, no, I've seen loads of those." And it's like, that's just dirty ice, though. That's just dirty water. And I was like, "Yeah, exactly. Take me to the places with the dirty ice and the dirty water. That's where all the organisms live." And anywhere, but even on the snow and in the water, you will find a few microorganisms. But these dark areas are particular hotspots of biodiversity for the glaciers.
It feels like wherever you are on the planet, somebody somewhere wants to go there and gets excited about what might be there, even
Yeah,
if it
absolutely.
looks like muddy ice.
Extreme
Fantastic.
environments are my whole discipline. So finding things right in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of an island, on the middle of a glacier is very exciting for me.
It's where you want to be. Well, let's talk about the island where you went, because you went to a place called Signy Island, which is part of Antarctica, but it's not a place many of us will have heard about. Tell us exactly where it is in relation to the rest of the world.
Signy Island is part of the continuation of islands from the Antarctic Peninsula. So if you're familiar with a map of Antarctica, and there's a sort of spike going off the side that you can see in this picture, That's actually lots of islands that are connected together by ice. And then the land continues to go into smaller islands all the way across. And Signy Island is one of those. It's one of the South Orkney Islands. So it's in the area of the Antarctic Peninsula. It's a subantarctic island, and it's a bit further south than other islands such as South Georgia and the Falklands, which people might have been more likely to come across.
So yeah, we're just seeing from the map there, it's definitely out on a limb, as it were, quite isolated. How did you actually get there? Because I guess you don't get a direct flight there from Heathrow.
No, it's quite far even from the main British research station, which is Rothera Research Station. You can actually only get there by the ship, one of the Antarctic icebreaker ships that I carried on the James Clerk Ross. And so we flew to South America and then on a normal passenger plane. And then we took the British Antarctic Survey's plane, the Dash, down to Rothera Station, which is a small plane that's good at landing on icy areas. And then from Rothera, we took the ship to Signy Island. And this is my crew on the little boat taking us off the ship. To find our new home for the next 5 weeks.
And it's just a small group of you with a lot of luggage, it looks like.
Yeah, there's only 8 of us on the island at the time. Signy can only really hold a maximum of 10 or 12 people, so 8 was quite a lot for the island. It's only 3 kilometers across. And because there are only 8 of us, it's all people who are working the station. There's no cook, there's no cleaner, there's no even doctor. We're very responsible for ourselves and for each other. And because, like I said, you can only access it by ship, it's not big enough for planes or even helicopters to land. We have to be very careful with our safety and with each other's safety. So with the 8 of us, there was a station leader, field guide, zoologist looking at the penguins, someone who's looking after the jenny shed, the generator, and then myself, my field partner, and a couple of people from the British Antarctic Survey working on the station. So it's a very select group. All of us were sharing a room, except one. And yeah, we did a bit of everything. We took it in shifts to cook and take care of the station.
So yeah, it looks like no one goes to this island unless you have a very specific role to play and an important reason to be there.
Yes, exactly. Signy's a bit of a special one because it's out of the way even for the Antarctic islands, and it's only open for the summer because it has quite a changeable climate and very few people who can stay there.
Excellent. Well, if you guys want to find out more about what it's really like in a place like that, send us in your questions, and Jaz will be able to tell us a bit more. So tell us what is Signy Island like? You know, I imagine it's like a snow-covered landscape.
As you can see there, not all of it is covered in ice and snow. Remember, this is in the summer, so this is the warmest it gets. And it was described to me that Antarctic summer is kind of like Scottish winter. So I'm not wearing a massive mink or anything. I'm wearing quite normal field gear, but making sure I have lots of layers because once you're out on the glacier, that's when it gets cold. It's the whole island kind of comes up to a peak in the middle, so it's sort of like almost like one big mountain if you kind of simplify it, where the ice cap is at the top, and this big ice cap flows into 2 glaciers, and those were the habitats that I was studying, from right at the top of the island with the very cold cryoclonate holes to the streams they flow into, to the meltwater ponds at the edge of the glacier. You have all of these distinct habitats, and then beyond the ice cap there are some tiny plants, no trees, just mosses and things about this big. And that's where you get a lot more animals. You have the moss banks and the beach, and that's where the larger wildlife is. On the top of the island, it's pretty much just microorganisms and me.
I mean, it looks stunning looking at the photographs here. There's a sort of, you know, if you're someone who likes kind of unspoilt wilderness, this absolutely fits the bill. But you know, it does look like a tough environment to have to work in every day. You know, you're doing a lot of hiking.
Yes, because like I said, the whole island is up from the shores, then it meant that our research station is right by the beach, and every morning it's a climb at whatever it was, 45-degree angle, just to get to the main part of the island. And then if we're working on the ice cap or on the other side of the ice cap, we need to make sure the visibility is clear so it's safe. We can only walk up lines that we know don't have crevasses. It's a lot of heavy hiking up a lot of hills. So our morning commute first thing, you know, 8 or 9 a.m. is going up quite a slope. It's satisfying to get to the top, but yeah, difficult.
And that's it. Once you get to the top, you've got to start working. That's the thing, isn't it? And then come back down at the end of the day. It's certainly a very tough physical work. And as someone who grew up in Scotland and did a lot of hiking, and some of it in winter weather, I can sympathise with how tough that must be. But to do it day in, day out, and you're working when you're up there, it must be quite difficult. Now, what did you actually find then while you were there? What were your findings from being there?
My main finding was that these separate habitats, the cryoconite, the streams, the ponds, they all housed different ecosystems. So the composition of what microorganisms were there were different in different habitats, even when they were connected to each other. Sometimes some microbes became completely absent when you moved from one habitat to another. So that means in a time of melt, if a stream melts into a pond, then the whole ecosystem is changing, not just the landscape. And that happened pretty often on Cygni. The environment was quite dynamic. After rain or snow, these ecosystems could appear or they could disappear in a day. And every time that happens, the whole bottom of the food chain is changing the composition of the organisms that are there. So that was the main thing that I found while my field partner was there looking around for microplastics. So we had a couple of different projects on the go. And yeah, I'm really excited to report it because I think it shows how sensitive these glacial ecosystems are.
Right. Now, we've just had a question come in, actually, which I was going to ask you about, because it sounds like this is a very sensitive environment. If it changes so quickly, and as you say, they're all connected. So you've got glaciers into streams, into lakes, and then eventually down into the coastline and the sea, and it's all connected together. Is climate change affecting this environment? Because it sounds like it absolutely will do. If the glacier starts to melt, that's going to have a profound effect on the area.
Yes, definitely. I was looking at a map that was given to me by my supervisor at the museum, Anna Youngblood, who'd been there a few years before. And some of the lakes that were present on this map as permanent lakes were just gone because they turned into streams. The way that the glacier melted had changed even over the last 6 years. The people who've worked there for a long time, like the station leader, was saying how much more rain there is. They could barely get the skidoo out over the snow, that vehicle that they use, because it was too wet, it was too slippery. This is something that I found in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, is that the kind of subtropical weather of having lots of rain is encroaching further and further towards the poles. And I know that, it's hard to say trends over only 6 years reliably, but fortunately we have climate records from a lot longer. So you can see this big global trend over the last 100 years of how things are changing.
And I guess it's so tricky to see these changes sometimes, because as I say, you work with microscopic life, the kind of life that you're not going to see in passing. You really have to dig in and look quite literally and really examine it. It takes time and effort to actually see what's there, which makes monitoring those trends and the effect that climate change might be having a bit more difficult.
Yeah, it becomes quite a complex web. One of the ways we do measure it is by looking at the glaciers as a whole and how much they're retreating. Because as well as, like I said, these microorganisms being the bottom of the food chain for the island, they're also part of what we call the biogeochemical cycle of the glacier in the ground. So when you've had rain and the environment starts to get darker because sediment is being swept down from the top of the island by the water and it's being brushed up by the wind, then you get this dark matter deposited on the glacier. That then makes the whole albedo, the whiteness of the entire surface, change, which leads to more melt. So you have this kind of cyclical effect where the warmer it gets, the more microorganisms and different matter gets deposited on the glacier. It becomes a darker color, it absorbs more solar radiation, and it gets warmer again. So these microbes are involved in the food chain, the kind of biological cycle, but also in the chemical cycle. They produce carbon dioxide, they produce oxygen, they cycle nitrogen. So that's one of the ways that we observe the changes on glaciers on a larger scale. We don't just look at individual microbes, we look at what the whole interconnected ecosystem is doing.
Right, yes, a lot to see there. And it's interesting that you talk about the basis of the food chain there, because there's more than microbes there as well, isn't there? You did encounter some some of the larger animals that some of us might recognize.
Yeah, once you have your microbes running down, and then you get to, like I said, the moss banks, where you see a few birds hanging around, you see feathers stuck to the ice, and then you see the large colonies of penguins by the coast and an awful lot of seals hauled out onto the beach. My field partner Becky and I were lucky enough to be able to help the zoologist look at the penguin chicks that were going on their first swim out to sea and making sure they were healthy enough to make the trip. That was really cool to be able to get a bit closer up to the penguins and see how they were doing.
Completely oblivious to what was going on in the wider world, because these penguins and the other animals you were finding, I guess, really don't see people, because this is an uninhabited island, and there were only 8 of you there, and you're only there in the summer, as you say. So it's definitely quite it sounds like an untouched gem, really.
Yeah, the penguins ignored most of us. The zoologist, who bothers them a bit more, they were a bit funnier about him. The elephant seals, like the one in this picture here, they have a bit of a reputation of fighting, because most of the videos of them are from the breeding season, when they're at each other's throats. But most of the year they're very sweet and just quite lazy, and so we're trying to keep our distance from the wildlife and be good scientists, but they're just lying right in front of our front doors. Sometimes we have to have a fence to make sure that the seals aren't blocking our way out, because they're so heavy. And then the first seals just always look really surprised to see you, and they might sort of chase you a bit. They're a bit like stray dogs. They can get a bit aggy. So we're sort of picking our way through, trying to disturb the animals as little as possible and reassure them that we're not there for them.
or we want to find out more about you, but we're not going to disturb you while we do it as much as possible. Yeah, brilliant. Fantastic. Well, guys, if you've got any questions for Jaz that you want to ask, please do pop them in the chat, and we'll take as many of them as we can. But if Jaz, I really want to talk to you today about, not only is it, it's interesting in and of itself going to Antarctica and doing this research, but you ended up being there when the entire world was going through this unprecedented event, the COVID-19 virus spreading around the world, and a pandemic being declared, and all of this was happening while you were away, and you were in one of the most remote places in the world. When did you realize that something big was going on out there, and it was probably going to affect you, but you were in this sort of inhospitable and very difficult to get out of part of the world?
When we left for Antarctica, it was only in early to mid-February. So while we knew something was happening in Wuhan, we had no idea if it would spread to the rest of the world. It was only when we were working on Signy Island in March, then we started to hear that this was being declared an epidemic and then a pandemic. And the internet was very limited, as you might not be surprised to hear, on this remote island that you can only get to by ship. And it had to be reserved for the station leader to pass on news from the British Antarctic Survey to us. And they tried to keep us informed, but a lot of questions they just didn't know. They didn't know if our travel plans would be changed. They said, we don't think they will, we hope not, but they couldn't make us any promises. So we were due to leave Signy at the end of April, and we left Signy on time, and we went back down to Rothera, the main station, deeper into Antarctica, where this photo was taken, right in the ice. We ended up there a bit longer than we planned to, because the logistics were being sorted out. We were trying to get supplies, and it looked like at that point the Falklands had also got cases of COVID-19. So we wanted to avoid going on land on the Falklands, because there is a slight possibility of catching COVID. We already had to pick up a new doctor. She'd come in from South America. There was a slight chance that she could have COVID. So we had to try not to mix the groups, even though we'd all been in Antarctica for months and we're probably fine. Just one person coming in meant we had to be so careful, because even at the larger research station, Rothera, where they do have doctors, they don't have facilities to hold several people on incubators, which is unfortunately what was happening in the UK with serious cases of COVID.
Yeah, I mean, that must have been quite scary, because I think if I'm thinking back to the initial days of the pandemic, when, and this is speaking as someone who was in the UK at the time, and we were getting updates in the news constantly, but there was so much we didn't know. Like, you couldn't test initially. There was no way of testing, certainly not a way for you to test yourself at home. You didn't even know if, like, when you got deliveries through the mail, if that, you know, if touching the mail was going to contaminate you, or if someone out for a run in the park ran past you, if you're going to pick it up from their breathing, you know, all this kind of stuff. There was so much unknowns, and I guess a lot of that's amplified for you guys because you weren't getting every little update that was coming through on a rolling basis. Really, you just had to kind of work with what you had, I suppose.
Yeah, they tried to keep the information that they gave to us from the British Antarctic Survey very functional and very practical. And then we were just getting, you know, the odd email would come through of my field partner's mum saying that the supermarkets have run out of toilet roll. And we were thinking, oh, what's going on? It was so strange hearing these
You must have
snippets
thought
of
the world
news.
was ending. Yeah.
Yeah.
We just had a question in from Tom Dragon on Twitch. Were you all British researchers, or were there other nationalities too?
We were all working as part of visitors to the British Antarctic Survey. The other countries have their own research stations, America, Ukraine, Russia, and they had to all organise their way through and their way back. But as for the people who were there, although it was mostly British, we did have people who needed to get back to Germany. We had someone who needed to get back to Canada and the Netherlands. So for them, they had the added worry that, okay, BAS have made this plan of how to get to the UK, back to the UK. Then I have to get home. And so the British Antarctic Survey were trying to make sure that they had the following on plans as well. And they had to talk to quite a lot of governments, actually. Eventually, they phoned up the Falklands, basically, the Falklands authorities, and said, well, we don't want to come on land in the Falklands and risk infection and not be able to get back to sea. So do you have any ships that are empty whose trips have been cancelled? So we ended up staying on a cruise ship just for a month, trying to get everyone out of Antarctica onto the ship together so we could sort a plan to go home. So there's a lot of waiting around, floating around.
Yeah, and actually, you know, it's interesting thinking about the cruise industry was an industry that completely shut down. Like, obviously, like one of the worst places to be with any kind of disease outbreak is on a cruise ship where people are in close proximity. So yeah, was it becoming apparent that maybe the only way home is on a ship? Because obviously you flew to Antarctica in the first instance, but you weren't going to be flying home if the borders were shut.
No, this is the problem, that even if the Falklands agreed to let us fly, we'd have to stop somewhere to refuel. So that meant, you know, negotiating with at least 3 countries to open their borders. And that's very risky. Like I said, once we go on land, if we're exposed to COVID and a flight gets cancelled, what do you do? So eventually they asked this cruise ship, which was an Antarctic adventure cruise ship, not a sort of like luxury Disney cruise ship. It was quite small cruise ship to go, but still very lovely. They kindly agreed to set up a contract with BAS and take us all the way home. And the hotel manager for the cruise ship said that the crew there had been polishing the same banister for a month because their trips had been cancelled a month ago and they had nothing to do. And so I think they were eventually quite glad to have us there. These pictures show the knitting club that a couple of us started. We asked to sneak some wool in from the Falklands and did some knitting. We taught a digger driver how to crochet. It was great. And then we played some games with the crew, some sort of old Navy games like this horse racing game, and, you know, tried to keep morale up, keep ourselves busy, you know, try and do exercise every morning, which was harder when the ship was moving, but, you know, it was possible. To just try and keep everyone together and in good spirits, really, because we were all from all over the world. We were all from different industries. It wasn't all scientists. Most of the people there were builders on the crew who'd been working on Rotherham Wharf as builders. And then there were cleaners, there were cooks, there was the crew of the cruise ship who had all kinds of jobs. There were aeronautical engineers. You know, we were people who never would have met otherwise.
Yeah, quite a mix. And I imagine the crew of the ship probably loved having you there, because if you weren't there, they'd have had nothing to do. You know,
we did hear that they were very bored. I think it took a while to integrate, but I really hope that we were good guests. I think everyone got on quite well. We made some friends. You know, we didn't just make friends with different people who'd been traveling with the British Antarctic Survey. We made some friends with the crew. You know, we made some connections. My friend Danny was working as in Rotherham, as, you know, doing some cleaning and some security and some work keeping the station running. And, you know, now we're still in touch a year later and she's going back down to Rotherham. You know, I think that as much as it was very stressful, being away from our friends and family and being with people who are sort of pseudo colleagues. So you didn't want to upset anyone too much because you may be working with these people again and you're all stuck together and you're all sharing rooms. As much as that was quite stressful, you know, a lot of people were left alone. My partner was left alone at home. And I think in some ways we were really lucky.
I guess mental health must have been a bit of a concern because, you know, you at least you were comfortable, you were on the ship, but for a long time you weren't allowed to go anywhere. Right? The ship was, yes, you had a bed, you're being fed and watered, as it were, and you had a roof over your head, but you weren't actually getting any closer to home. And that must have been quite worrying because at that stage, nobody knew, you know, vaccines for this were far away. You know, that was a hope that we had, but no one knew what was going to happen with them. And you're like, what is the way out of this situation? So I guess that must have been quite a strain on yourself and a lot of you that were on this ship.
The not knowing what we would be coming back to was quite difficult, particularly for people who had family members who were unwell, or for people who were supposed to be doing contract work and had nowhere to live and nowhere to work because, you know, they usually work half the year in Antarctica and then work half the year somewhere else, and all that was cancelled. So there was a lot of uncertainty. The time difference was a pain. You know, I was on the phone to people at 5 a.m. sometimes trying to get through. There was limited internet. So that was another reason to, you know, call in the middle of the night when someone else wasn't using WhatsApp. It was quite a kind of juggling act. And like you said, particularly when we were just floating off the coast of the Falklands for a month, nothing's changing, it starts to get a bit Groundhog Day. So I imagine, like all of you did at home, you know, in the UK and other countries, we tried to make a schedule, we tried to exercise, we tried to do activities, you know, do quizzes and stuff, like keep ourselves going a bit. Because I realized that I think it was about 3 months between setting foot on land, and longer than that before sleeping on land. You know, between I slept on land on Sydney, and then, you know, we had 3 months-ish before I was sleeping in my own bed in the UK, and we weren't allowed to go on land anytime. When we were refueling and getting supplies, we tried to do as much as we can in small boats across the sea to reduce the contamination. So lots of time getting a bit Groundhog Day, floating, losing my land legs.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, even when you're not moving, a boat is still rocking slightly in the water. I mean, did you get seasick at all? That would have been nightmarish if you could never get off the boat.
I felt very strange sometimes. Fortunately, my body tends to just shut down and go to sleep, which I think is quite a good reaction to seasickness. Other people just had to be outside for, you know, days and couldn't really eat much. So I count myself quite lucky. But the middle of the Atlantic was actually quite calm. We got to do some dolphin watching. My lovely ornithologist roommate told me what all of the birds were. So again, you know, as much as there was stress involved, in some ways we were incredibly lucky and privileged to be able to get that experience. So few people do. There were ex-Navy and, you know, ex-fisheries people saying, God, I never usually be on a boat this long. Normally you'd stop everywhere you go. So strange being on a boat for, you know, a whole 2 months. It felt a bit, you know, Victorian.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like those voyages across the Atlantic when they were discovering America and things like that. What a unique experience that you had. But obviously, it does end happily. You did make it home eventually, albeit months later. And I imagine a lot of people, given that it's now November, I wonder if a lot of people are going back out to Antarctica because it's the summertime down there now.
Yeah, like I said, one of the friends I made on the ship back in Rotherham, and I thought, wow, you're really? But no, you know, people love it. People are going back out. The next season after, it was a bit of a skeleton crew. You know, they tried not to put too many people out because they didn't know what would happen. But now it's kind of going back to normal. People are starting to do polar science again. You know, we have to be careful because of COVID, but we're starting to get back out there because there is work that needs to be done. There's monitoring that's been going on every year for, you know, decades. There's been no gaps in the records of the albatrosses and the penguins. And so, you know, we want to keep that going, and we want to keep a close eye on the climate particularly.
Yeah. Well, it's been really great to talk to you today, Jaz. And I wish you all the best with the rest of your research. I know you'll be publishing your findings soon, and I'm sure it's going to trigger, you know, with all the talk of climate change at the moment, you know, we've just had COP26 and things, it's definitely on a lot of people's radars. I'm sure it's going to lead to some really important further work in that part of the world. And I suppose you've got a unique experience you can look back on that hopefully you don't have to repeat, but you've got a good story to share. But thanks very much for chatting to us today, and all the best.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the questions.
You're welcome. Well, that's all we've got time for today, but it's been really lovely to chat to Jaz, and thank you guys as well for tuning in, for sharing your questions and watching with us today. As always, if you enjoyed the show and want to support us, then do consider making a small donation to the museum using the donate button by the chat box on YouTube, or you can go onto the museum's website if you wish to do it that way. Next week, we'll be taking a look at some cutting-edge research and Darwin's Tree of Life. But until then, thank you very much and goodbye.